Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care.
The twin moons cast pale light over the dense forests of Iridia Prime, painting the landscape in hues of silver and green. George Reed adjusted his grip on the rifle slung across his back, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. He was returning from a routine hunt, a few small game creatures stowed in his pack, when he noticed something unusual. A faint, glowing trail smeared across the ground, leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't the bioluminescent flora he was used to. This was different. Blood. Alien blood. George's brow furrowed. Iridia Prime was far from any settled trade routes, and the only other signs of civilization on the planet were long-abandoned ruins. He knelt by the trail, examining the faint shimmer in the liquid that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. Whatever had bled here wasn't from the usual wildlife. Following the trail, he tightened his grip on his rifle. It led to a small clearing, where a figure lay sprawled on the ground, motionless. George hesitated, scanning the area for signs of a trap. The figure was slender, draped in tattered, iridescent fabric, and unmistakably alien. Silver skin glowed faintly in the moonlight, and long, silken hair pooled around the figure's head like liquid starlight. "Damn it!" George muttered under his breath, lowering his rifle. He approached cautiously, noting the faint rise and fall of the alien's chest. She was alive, but barely. Her left leg bore a deep gash, the blood still oozing faintly. Beside her was a shattered piece of metal, part of what looked like an advanced weapon. Her eyelids fluttered as he crouched beside her. Her eyes opened, and he froze. They were like pools of liquid light, shifting colors in a mesmerizing dance. Fear flickered in her gaze, and she tried to push herself away. "Easy," George said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but his tone seemed to calm her. Her head fell back, exhaustion overtaking her attempts to resist. George assessed her wounds. The gash was deep, but not life-threatening with the right care. With a sigh, he lifted her into his arms. Her skin was cool to the touch, and she weighed far less than he expected. He carried her back to his cabin, a modest but sturdy structure hidden among the trees. Inside, he laid her on a cot and set to work cleaning her wound. As he worked, he noticed the faint hum of technology embedded in her wrist, a translator, damaged but reparable. He set it aside for later. The alien stirred as he finished bandaging her leg. She whispered something in a soft, melodic language, her gaze locking onto his. Though the words were unintelligible, her gratitude was clear. George nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're safe here," he said, even though he knew she couldn't understand him. For now, as he sat back, exhaustion creeping in, he couldn't help but wonder who, or what, had brought her to this remote planet, and more importantly, whether they'd come looking for her. Morning arrived with the soft hum of Iridia Prime's peculiar wildlife. George stirred from his spot near the cot, where he'd spent the night keeping watch. The alien girl, still asleep, seemed more peaceful than when he'd found her. Her silvery skin glimmered faintly in the morning light, and her wounds appeared less inflamed, a good sign. George's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the night before. He moved quietly to the small kitchen area and prepared a simple meal of roasted alien root vegetables and dried meat. When he turned back, her luminous eyes were open, watching him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "You're awake," he said, keeping his tone calm. He gestured toward the plate of food. "You hungry?" She didn't respond but tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand. George approached slowly, setting the plate down on a small table near the cot. She hesitated, then reached out, her delicate fingers trembling as she picked up a piece of the roasted vegetable. She sniffed it cautiously before taking a small bite. Her eyes widened slightly, and she ate more eagerly. George sat down across from her, observing her closely. "So, what's your story?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't understand but hoping his tone might encourage her to speak. She surprised him by responding. Her words flowed in a melodic language he didn't recognize, but her tone carried an unmistakable note of urgency. She gestured to the damaged device on her wrist, and George realized it was some kind of translator. He retrieved it from the table where he'd left it and examined it closely. The technology was advanced, but not entirely foreign to him. With some basic tools, he managed to repair the device enough to activate it. A soft, robotic voice crackled to life. "Silani, thank you. Safe." George blinked in surprise. "You're Silani," he repeated, and she nodded. The translation was rough, but enough to establish basic communication. Over the next few hours, Sylvia explained her situation in fragmented phrases. She was part of the Silani, a reclusive nomadic race known for their ethereal beauty and innate connection to certain rare energies. Her people were prized and often exploited for their unique pheromones, especially during their mating season, which heightened their allure to dangerous levels. Sylvia had been fleeing a group of mercenaries who sought to capture and sell her to the highest bidder. Her ship had been shot down over Iridia Prime, and she had barely escaped with her life. George listened intently, his protective instincts flaring. "So they're still hunting you?" he asked, and her solemn nod confirmed his fears. "Help? Stay hidden?" she asked hesitantly, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. George leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He hadn't planned to get involved in anyone else's problems, especially not ones as dangerous as this. But looking at Sylvia, so vulnerable yet resolute, he knew he couldn't turn her away. "You can stay," he said finally, "but we need to be careful. If they're looking for you, they'll come here eventually." Her face lit up with relief, and she bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." For the first time, George allowed himself to smile. "Guess we've got some work to do." As the day wore on, the bond between them began to grow. Sylvia's gratitude and vulnerability touched a part of George he thought he'd buried long ago. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the calm before the storm. The next few days passed in a delicate balance of routine and unease. George focused on fortifying the cabin and teaching Sylvia how to help with simple tasks. The more time they spent together, the more he noticed her intelligence and adaptability. She picked up on his gestures and basic words quickly, forming a rudimentary understanding of his language. Despite the growing sense of normalcy, George couldn't ignore the subtle changes in Sylvia's behavior. She seemed restless, her movements more fluid and deliberate. At times, she lingered closer to him than before, her gaze holding his longer than necessary. Her luminescent eyes had started to shift colors more frequently, a mesmerizing display that George found both beautiful and disconcerting. One evening, while they were sitting by the fireplace, Sylvia suddenly stood up and approached him. Her proximity sent an unexpected warmth coursing through George, and he tensed. She reached out, her slender fingers brushing against his hand. "George," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight he couldn't quite place. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady. She struggled to find the words, her translator device crackling as it attempted to process her fragmented speech. "Feel. Change. Cannot stop," she finally said, her voice tinged with both frustration and embarrassment. George frowned, unsure what she meant. "What kind of change?" Before she could answer, a sudden, sharp sound outside the cabin snapped them both to attention. George was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle and motioning for Sylvia to stay back. He crept to the window and peered outside, his heart pounding. Through the dim light, he spotted movement, several figures moving stealthily through the trees. They were humanoid, clad in dark armor that blended seamlessly with the shadows. "Mercenaries. Stay here," George whispered, glancing back at Sylvia. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Slipping out the back door, George moved silently through the underbrush, his rifle at the ready. He circled around the cabin, using the traps he'd set earlier as a guide. The first mercenary triggered a tripwire, and a crude but effective explosive sent him flying. Shouts erupted from the others as they scrambled for cover. George took advantage of the chaos, picking off another mercenary with a precise shot. The others regrouped, their movements more cautious now. George could hear them communicating in low, guttural voices, their language unfamiliar, but their intent clear. Returning to the cabin, George found Sylvia standing near the door, her body tense and her eyes glowing brightly. "You need to stay hidden," he said firmly. She shook her head. No. Me. Smell." George's stomach dropped as her meaning sank in. Her pheromones, amplified by whatever biological changes she was experiencing, were drawing them to her like a beacon. He cursed under his breath, realizing the danger was far greater than he'd anticipated. The mercenaries closed in, and George knew they couldn't hold out much longer. "We have to move," he said, grabbing a small pack of supplies. "Can you run?" Sylvia nodded, though her expression betrayed her exhaustion. Together, they slipped out through a concealed tunnel George had dug as an escape route. The mercenaries were distracted by another of George's traps, giving them a head start. As they fled into the forest, George couldn't ignore the unspoken tension between them. Sylvia's condition was clearly worsening, and he was running out of options. For now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. George and Sylvia trekked deeper into the forest, their path lit only by the faint glow of Iridia Prime's bioluminescent flora. Every step carried a weight of urgency. The mercenaries were skilled hunters, and even George's traps would only slow them down for so long. They finally stopped in a secluded cave nestled between jagged cliffs. George scanned their surroundings before motioning for Sylvia to sit. She sank onto a patch of moss, her silvery skin damp with perspiration and her luminous eyes flickering with exhaustion. George knelt beside her, concern etched into his face. "Are you all right? You look worse." Sylvia nodded faintly, but didn't meet his gaze. Her translator buzzed as she struggled to find the right words. "Not worse. Change. Faster." George frowned. "What kind of change are we talking about here?" Her breathing quickened, and she clutched at the fabric of her tattered clothing. "Season. Silani. Cannot stop. Pheromones." She trailed off, frustration evident as the translator faltered. George's confusion deepened. "Season. You mean this is something natural for your species?" Sylvia nodded, biting her lip. "Mating season. My body. Calls. Others. Smell. Danger." The weight of her words sank in, and George leaned back, running a hand through his hair. It all made sense now. The mercenaries weren't just after her for her rarity. Her heightened pheromones during this period were like a beacon, drawing anyone nearby. It also explained the subtle tension he'd felt around her, the unspoken pull that made him acutely aware of her presence. George's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to tell me this sooner?" Afraid," Sylvia whispered, her voice breaking. "Thought you reject. Fear me." Her vulnerability cut through his frustration. He sighed, his tone softening. "I don't fear you, Sylvia, but we need to figure out how to handle this, or those bastards will find us again." Sylvia looked away, her glowing eyes dimming. "Cannot stop. Only bond." George froze. "What do you mean by bond?" The translator crackled as Sylvia struggled to explain. "Silani. Need partner. Only way. Stop call. Safe." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. George felt a rush of conflicting emotions, protectiveness, confusion, and an undeniable attraction he had been trying to suppress. But this wasn't just about him. Sylvia was fighting against a biological drive she couldn't control, one that made her a target in more ways than one. "We'll figure something out," he said finally, his voice steady. "But right now, we need to focus on staying alive." Sylvia's gaze softened, and she gave a faint nod. "Trust you, George." Her trust weighed on him. He had saved her life, but now he realized she had placed her entire future in his hands. The thought was as daunting as it was humbling. George woke to the distant sound of a ship's engines. His pulse quickened as he climbed to the edge of the cave and peered out. A sleek mercenary dropship was circling above the forest, its searchlights slicing through the dense canopy. "They're getting closer," he muttered, returning to where Sylvia sat, her body tense and her glowing eyes watching him intently. "They smell me," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "Cannot hide." George crouched beside her, his mind racing. "Then we make them regret coming after you." The mercenaries' dropship roared overhead, its searchlights scouring the dense forest. George crouched in the shadows of the cave's entrance, his rifle at the ready, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Sylvia sat behind him, her glowing eyes betraying the fear and frustration she felt. "They'll find us if we stay here," George whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of the ship's engines. "But they're underestimating us." Sylvia's translator buzzed as she responded. "Danger! Because of me. Can I stay?" George turned to face her, his gaze steady. "It's not just you anymore, Sylvia. We're in this together. And if they want to fight, they'll get one." She nodded, her fear giving way to a faint resolve. "Help? Fight?" George's lips twitched into a grim smile. "Good, because I've got a plan." Under the cover of the dense forest, George led Sylvia to a series of traps he had prepared earlier. Each one was designed to exploit the terrain, using explosives and makeshift barriers to funnel the mercenaries into choke points. Sylvia, despite her condition, helped him as best she could, her natural agility making her invaluable in setting up the ambush. By the time the mercenaries reached the area, George was ready. The first group moved cautiously, their black armor blending into the shadows. But as they passed through a narrow gorge, a tripwire activated a concealed explosive. The blast sent two of them flying, and chaos erupted among the others. George took his first shot, the high-powered rifle punching through the armor of one mercenary. He moved quickly, repositioning before the others could pinpoint his location. Sylvia watched from a safe distance, her glowing eyes tracking the mercenaries' movements. The remaining soldiers regrouped, their voices sharp and guttural as they coordinated. George heard the whine of a plasma weapon charging and ducked just as a searing beam of light tore through the trees above him. "Persistent bastards," he muttered, lining up another shot. He dropped another mercenary, his aim precise and unyielding. As the battle raged, Sylvia began to feel the weight of her condition pressing down on her. Her body burned with a heat she couldn't quell, and the pheromones she emitted grew stronger, even against her will. She saw one of the mercenaries break off from the group, his movements erratic, as if drawn by an invisible force. "No," she whispered, her translator crackling. The mercenary moved toward her, his weapon forgotten, his steps faltering. Sylvia realized her pheromones were affecting him, clouding his mind. She clenched her fists, summoning her strength. If her condition was a liability, she would make it a weapon. When the mercenary reached her, she moved swiftly, using a jagged piece of debris to strike him across the back of the neck. The mercenary crumpled, unconscious. Sylvia stared at him for a moment, her breathing heavy, before retreating to rejoin George. The remaining mercenaries regrouped, bringing heavier firepower. The dropship descended, its side hatch opening to reveal a mounted plasma cannon. George cursed under his breath, knowing they were running out of time. "We have to end this now," he said, glancing at Sylvia. "Are you with me?" She nodded, determination shining through her exhaustion. Together. George led Sylvia to a final choke point, a narrow ravine with only one exit. As the mercenaries pursued, he activated a concealed device, triggering a rock slide that blocked their retreat. The dropship hovered overhead, its cannon swiveling toward them. "Stay low," George shouted, pulling Sylvia behind a boulder. The plasma cannon fired, obliterating the cover around them. George knew they couldn't hold out much longer. With grim resolve, he reached into his pack and pulled out a makeshift explosive. "This is going to be close." Sylvia watched him, her eyes wide. "You risk?" George gave her a faint smile. "You're worth it." With that, he darted out from cover, sprinting toward the dropship. The mercenaries fired wildly, but George's agility kept him just ahead of the barrage. He threw the explosive, aiming for the ship's exposed thrusters. The explosion was deafening, and the dropship shuddered violently before crashing into the ravine. The remaining mercenaries scrambled to retreat, their morale shattered. George stumbled back to Sylvia, his body aching and his breathing ragged. She caught him as he collapsed, her cool hands cradling his face. "You safe," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "For now," George muttered, his lips curling into a faint smile. "But this isn't over." The forest was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Smoke rose from the wreckage of the mercenaries' dropship, casting a hazy glow against the pale light of Iridia Prime's twin moons. George and Sylvia sat together in a hidden alcove, a makeshift shelter amidst the ruins of their fight for survival. George leaned against the wall of the cave, his breathing labored and his body battered. Sylvia knelt beside him, her glowing eyes filled with concern. She had already used a small medkit from the cabin to clean his wounds, her delicate hands working quickly and efficiently despite her trembling fingers. "You're hurt," she said softly, her translator crackling as it processed her words. "I've had worse," George replied, his voice rough but steady. "You're the one we should be worried about." Sylvia shook her head, her silvery skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. "You saved me. Again." George managed a faint smile. "You helped. That makes us even." Her gaze lingered on him, a mix of gratitude and something deeper. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his cheek. "George, why what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Why risk so much for me?" George let out a quiet sigh, his eyes searching hers. "Because I couldn't stand by and do nothing. You didn't deserve any of this." Sylvia's expression softened, her luminous eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "No one ever cared before. Always. Run. Hide." "You don't have to run anymore," George said firmly. "Not while I'm around." The weight of her pheromones filled the air, and George felt the subtle warmth of her presence growing stronger. He tried to ignore the pull, but it was impossible to deny the unspoken connection between them. Sylvia seemed to sense it too, her breathing quickening as she fought against her instincts. "I cannot stop," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Season too strong." George's jaw tightened as he realized the depth of her struggle. He reached out, taking her hands in his. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out." Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment the translator's mechanical voice fell silent. The intensity of her emotions didn't need words. She leaned closer, her luminous eyes filled with both longing and fear. "You trust me," she whispered. George nodded, his voice steady. "With my life." Her hands trembled as she cupped his face, her touch cool against his skin. "Then, let me trust you." The barriers between them dissolved as Sylvia leaned in, her silken hair brushing against George's cheek. He met her halfway, their connection deepening as their lips met in a tender, electric kiss. The warmth between them grew, not just from her heightened pheromones, but from the genuine bond they had forged through shared struggles and mutual respect. George's hands found her waist, steadying her as she moved closer. Sylvia's luminous skin seemed to pulse softly in response to his touch, her glowing eyes filled with wonder and vulnerability. Their connection was not merely physical. It was a melding of two souls who had found solace in each other amidst chaos and danger. As the night deepened, they shared an intimate moment that went beyond words, a mutual act of trust and compassion that eased Sylvia's biological need and solidified their bond. Hours later, they lay together in the quiet of the cave, the tension in the air replaced by a serene stillness. Sylvia rested her head against George's chest, her breathing slow and even. George ran a hand gently through her silken hair, his mind racing with thoughts of what came next. "You okay?" he asked softly. Sylvia nodded, her voice steady but quiet. "Better. Safe. Because of you." George smiled faintly, his grip on her tightening. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we'll make it." Sylvia shifted to look up at him, her eyes glowing softly. George, thank you. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his voice firm. You don't need to thank me. You're not just someone to protect, Sylvia. You're more than that. Her luminous eyes shimmered with emotion, and she whispered, Together. Together. George agreed, his resolve strengthening. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. The first rays of Iridia Prime's twin suns pierced through the forest canopy, casting golden light on the wreckage of the previous night's battle. Smoke still rose from the shattered mercenary dropship, now a silent reminder of the danger they had narrowly escaped. George stirred, his body aching but his mind sharp. Sylvia lay beside him, her silvery skin catching the morning light. She stirred as well, her glowing eyes blinking open to meet his. Morning, George said, his voice softer than usual. Morning, Sylvia replied, her translator conveying the word with an almost human cadence. She pushed herself up, her movements slower than usual, but graceful nonetheless. George stood, scanning their surroundings. We can't stay here. That ship had a distress beacon. Reinforcements won't be far behind. Sylvia nodded, her expression serious. We leave. But where? George reached into his pack, pulling out a worn but functional data pad. He activated a holographic map of the planet, highlighting a remote canyon on the far side of the forest. There's an old smuggler's cache there. If we can get to it, we might find something we can use. Maybe even a ship. Sylvia hesitated, her gaze flickering with uncertainty. Far. You. Hurt. I'll manage, George assured her, his tone resolute. We don't have a choice. The trek across the forest was grueling. George's injury slowed him down, but he pushed through, his focus unwavering. Sylvia stayed close, her presence a quiet but steady source of strength. Despite her condition, she moved with determination, her instincts guiding them through the dense foliage. As they traveled, their bond deepened. They spoke in fragments, piecing together each other's stories. Sylvia shared memories of her homeworld, a place of crystalline cities and boundless skies, now lost to the greed of outsiders. George spoke of his time in the military, of battles fought and friends lost, and of the solitude he had sought on Iridia Prime. You hide, Sylvia said softly, her translator capturing the depth of her observation. Like me. George glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. I guess I was, but not anymore. By nightfall, they reached the canyon. Hidden within the rocky terrain was the entrance to the smuggler's cache, a reinforced door partially obscured by overgrown vines. George examined the keypad, his fingers deftly entering a series of codes he had learned years ago during his time in the military. The door hissed open, revealing a dimly lit chamber filled with crates and equipment. At the center of the room was a small, battered starship. It wasn't much to look at, but it was intact. This'll do, George said, his voice laced with relief. Sylvia approached the ship, her glowing eyes scanning it with curiosity. We escape. George nodded. Yeah, but first, we need to make sure it works. They spent hours repairing the ship, working side by side in a rhythm that felt natural. Sylvia's technical knowledge surprised George, her hands moving with precision as she adjusted circuits and calibrated systems. As they finished, George leaned against the hull, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Sylvia stood beside him, her expression unreadable. You, leaving behind, she said quietly. George shook his head, meeting her gaze. Not leaving anything behind. I've got everything I need right here. Sylvia's luminous eyes shimmered with emotion. Together, George smiled, the faintest hint of vulnerability in his expression. Together. As dawn broke, they boarded the ship. The controls hummed to life under George's hands, and the vessel lifted off, its engines cutting through the stillness of the forest. Sylvia sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. We're not out of the woods yet, George said, his tone cautious. They'll come after us. Sylvia nodded, her resolve evident. Then we fight together. George glanced at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. Yeah, together. The ship broke through the atmosphere, the vast expanse of space stretching out before them. For the first time in years, George felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose he thought he had lost. Beside him, Sylvia's presence was a constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, connection and trust could light the way forward.